Madam Chair, Representative.
Madam Chair, Ms. Cox, thank you so much for your information. I have been myself a participant in a numerous of these types of trainees, particularly implicit bias and explicit bias being part of the law enforcement community, and I really appreciate the trainings. Understanding from the senator that he has not participated in them, I find them to be very informal versus...
Representative, your question,
I am getting
please.
to the question. Versus one-sided. And could you elaborate on the perspective that that training comes from, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I'm entering a space to lead a diversity, equity, and inclusion facilitated session, I almost am never standing in front of the room telling people things. I will present different terms. We explore definitions together. How does this term relate to you and your personal experiences? We talk about people's identities, where they're from, how that impacts how they might show up in the workplace, and work on strengthening communication skills, empathetic listening, reflective listening skills, and we focus on how can we strengthen communication and team participation in this space through a recognition of all of our differences as a human, whether that's because of our race or our gender identity or our ability status, or because you grew up lower income or higher income. All of those conversations are at the core. And so we are exploring these topics. We will present facts as far as historical events, and then we have robust discussions and questions that are presented to the group that then they can have a back and forth conversation about. My goal in that space is to, as a facilitator, hold space for the conversation to happen and to make sure that we can manage. If there are feelings of guilt or anguish that come up, that is my space to then show up as a support for folks in that room to say, okay, we're working through big feelings, let's talk it out and let's work through this together. It strengthens people's leadership abilities and their ability to be productive and creative and really feel included on their teams.
Thank you, and that has also been in my experience. Thank you,
Representative Sprunger.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This question is for the bill sponsor.
Senator Tribus.
Madam Chair, Representative.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Senator Tribus, we can always promise you a robust hearing here in State Admin.
I appreciate it.
Thank you to everybody who's participating. So, this is an interesting topic for me. As I stated, I participate in facilitation. We don't do DEI training, but I know a lot of people who do. I know people who do it well. I'm not going to personally say I know anybody who doesn't do it well or not, right? And what I'm hearing from you is that you're not concerned so much about the ones that Ms. Cox is describing where there's space for people to have conversation, but potentially for topical. Do you have any interest in doing a study on this in the state of Montana to really understand where this is at, or is this more preventative in your mind?
Madam Chair, Representative, I'd call it more preventative. I'm not really a big fan of studies on things that we could probably search the internet for individually and then bring good legislation on. So I'm not terribly a big fan of studies, but sometimes studies do bring about some of the data that we need to produce good decisions here in this body, and sometimes they don't. But so my initial reaction is no, I'm not a big fan of a study on it, mostly because we can study it individually. And heck, I can go to YouTube and see if I can find some of these trainings that I can watch for myself, just so I can participate in one and see what I think, at least on what I can find online. So, but no, this is more preventative, to answer your question.
Right, follow-up, Madam Chair?
Follow-up.
Thanks again, and I'll say that I have some concerns on both sides,
Sure,
candidly.
thank you. Yeah, absolutely.
On both sides.
Okay, yeah.
So that said, do you have any concerns that by taking something from another state or a national or YouTube that we're potentially not customizing to the unique nature of Montana and the people here?
Oh, good question, Madam Chair, Representative. Yeah, I don't necessarily like template boilerplate type legislation. I've used some of it. I've done some of it. And I think we still probably possibly would have done this even if it wasn't happening in other places. It just seems like, whether we realize it or not, there's a lot of similar parallel tracks like Tennessee, Florida, us, that are moving down the same path to react to some of what we see going on, either from the federal government, federal level, executive branch, or what we see happening in other places nationally. So I think it's really just a lot of reaction, that some of which is happening organically and some of which is not. But So to answer your question, no, I don't necessarily love template language for some of this stuff, but each of us has our own touch on our own legislation, and I think that's true here. Could it be sharpened, say, by the committee and our amendment process? Absolutely. So that's kind of what this whole process is for, is to make it unique to us.
Thank you for accommodating all our questions.
Absolutely.
Madam Chair.
Yep.
Vice Chair Phelan.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the sponsor.
Senator?
Two-part question, kind of. Do you think people are being disenfranchised when they don't meet the criteria from Section 2A through G in not being hired? And also, why are people not being hired on their merits and their merits only?
Madam Chair, Representative, I would say that question might be a little outside the scope of this bill. I think it touches on surrounding issues, though. But what I would say is I would point to G and just say, you know, if we are training something that says that merit, excellent hard works, fairness, and neutrality objectively, and racial color blindness are racist or sexist, or at least even if they're not stated to be racist or sexist, even if they're stated to be maybe not important values or at least minimalized as values in a training, I think that could be harmful. So maybe not answering your question directly, just because I think it's a little off the scope of the bill, because that would be a hiring practice or promotion practice type thing that we're not addressing here. But I think that line 5, section 2G
kind of gets at how that might be talked about in the workplace.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yep.
One more follow-up for the doctor.
Dr. Gonzalez-Aller.
Madam Chair, Representative.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Cox said that she's been in Montana for 10 years. Are you born and raised Montana too?
No, I'm not. I was born and raised in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I moved to Montana in 2017, where I raised my family.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Any other questions from the committee? Representative Walsh.
Madam Chair, question for the bill sponsor.
Senator Tribus.
Madam Chair, Representative.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Senator. So when we talk about, you added the nothing in this section may be construed to prohibit discussing as part of a larger course of academic instruction. So would that include, you talked about colleges, universities, and this and that, would that include secondary, primary education, those type of things also?
Madam Chair, Representative, I was kind of wondering that myself. I'm not sure, but I would say that since I didn't specify, and this was actually Senator Fitzpatrick's amendment in the Senate side, and I thought it was a good one, but the way I would interpret it as written, I think it could be K through 12 or university at the way it's stated there.
So,
Follow-up.
Madam Chair, follow-up for the Senator. So prior to this, were we trying to eliminate what did we call it, CTR training or those type of things? Is that what you were aiming at before this amendment was in there?
Madam Chair, Representative, not particularly. They're related topics. CRT is critical race theory. It's something obviously we've talked about in other circles the last couple of years, I think. But no, as written, it wasn't aimed at that outside of the workforce. Inside the workforce, yes, it's definitely aimed at that.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Representative Green.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This question is for Ms. Cox, please.
Ms. Cox.
Madam Chair, Representative.
Madam Chair, Ms. Cox, love your outfit.
Thank you.
The question I have is, in your experience, I know where I grew up, it was completely different than here. And when people are mandated training that aren't necessarily open and ready for it, that's where I'm looking at this bill. There's the attempt on mandatory. I feel like people that when they're ready, are actually able to take things in easier, whereas if they're mandated, they usually reject things. Can you kind of tell me some of your experiences with that?
Yeah, thank you for your question. When I am, let me think about a situation. When I'm working with a client and they're bringing me in to do training for their staff, it depends. If it's a reaction potentially to harassment that has been caused in the organization or within a department, then yes, those are typically mandatory because it's important that the whole staff is on the same page about how to move forward from an incident where someone has espoused sexist or racist beliefs, right? So that is a point where it would be really valuable for it to be mandatory. Some trainings that are to further your professional development and you can strengthen your leadership development or inclusive leadership skills, those can often be voluntary. So it's dependent on what is necessary within that department and what they're trying to solve. Is it to offer general professional development for their staff, or is it to kind of redirect from harassment or wrongs that happened within that group of people? Thank you.
Any other questions from the committee? I have